From the book of Job, the New Living Translation. Job spoke, and he cursed the day of his birth. He said, "Is not all human life a struggle? Our lives are like that of a hired hand, like a worker who longs for the shade, like a servant waiting to be paid. I too have been assigned months of futility, long and weary nights of misery. Lying in bed, I think, when will it be morning? But the night drags on, and I toss till dawn. My body is covered with maggots and scabs. My skin breaks open, oozing with pus. My days fly faster than a weaver's shuttle. They end without hope. O God, remember that my life is but a breath, and I will never again feel happiness. I cannot keep from speaking. I must express my anguish. My bitter soul must complain. My friends laugh at me, for I call on God and expect an answer. I am a just and blameless man, yet they laugh at me. People who are at ease mock those in trouble. They give a push to people who are stumbling. But robbers are left in peace. And those who provoke God live in safety. God keeps them in his power. How frail is humanity! How short is life, full of trouble! Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. I invite you to join me in a brief moment of silent prayer and reflection on the Word of God. Amen. The book of Job is not an easy one for us to deal with. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Israelite community clearly wrestled with questions about the human condition, and they are questions that still confront us today. As the story goes on, Job, a man of great wealth, obedient to all the religious rules of his day, even down to making a sacrifice to God on behalf of each of his children, just in case one of his 7 sons or 3 daughters ever curse God in their hearts. He has thousands of livestock, including sheep, donkeys, oxen, camels, all highly valued in his homeland, what we now call the Middle East. In the first chapter, Job's prosperity is highlighted next to his piety and righteousness, and thus his good fortune is linked to his character and conduct. Then we read that in the heavenly court, God and Satan have an argument over whether or not there is such a thing as a righteous man. After all, if the good are always rewarded, then what is the motivation for being good? Love of God or getting the reward? Satan challenges God, and God points to Job, allowing Satan to do what he will to Job. And thus the full weight of an ultimate test of faith is brought to bear upon one man. Have you ever heard the phrase trial by fire? Well, Job was tried not only by fire that fell from the heavens and consumed all of his sheep and the servants that tended them, but also by raiders who stole all his cattle and donkeys and killed the servants that tended them. Then he was tried by a great wind that came and collapsed the house where his children were celebrating together as a family. Finally, even after all of that, Job was tried by illness that covered his body in painful, oozing sores. As readers, we know that these trials were not the result of anything Job did, and he himself can't understand what is going on. It is at this moment in his life when we hear the words of agony he cries out in the reading for today. 3 of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to sit with him in ashes as he grieves and questions. Each of them present the commonly held theological beliefs from that time on why such injustice occurred, why there is suffering in the world. Eliphaz argues that man is born unto trouble, that evil and impurity are part of human nature. Job must have done something wrong to deserve this punishment because he was predisposed to do something wrong. And his suffering is a corrective that he should welcome. Bildad and Zophar support even more explicitly this doctrine of retribution, that Job is being punished because of sin. It might be sin that he doesn't know he committed, but to them, his suffering must be the result of divine judgment. Yet Job knows, and we readers know, that it isn't true. Job is innocent and suffering. The disconnect between the theology and Job's lived experience challenges the thought of his time represented by his friends, and it challenges the way that we think about the human experience. How is it that we respond to human suffering? Like Job's friends so many years ago, we too are part of a culture that questions why. We are constantly looking for reasons and causes, and this is true in medicine, science, even theology. I had an assignment for class once, and the entire paper was on why things are the way they are in a worship service. The question of why is an integral part of who we are and how we operate in the world. But this is not helpful when it comes to trying to find a reason for suffering. Even now, there persists a pattern of thinking that claims poverty, illness, even natural disasters are divine retribution, that bad things are the result of sinful behavior. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But I just don't buy it. For example, in the face of slavery, both historic and its modern forms, I refuse to believe that somehow people deserved it. There is no righteousness in injustice. There is no cause to be found in suffering. It is a curse without a cause. There are only situations that call on us for prayer and for healing. A friend of mine shared with me that one time when she was going through some trials of her own, she looked to the book of Job. She noticed that Job cries out to God in his despair for 37 chapters. God doesn't speak until chapter 38. She told me that she fell down on her knees and begged, "What chapter am I on, God? When will you answer me?" In her questioning and in the cries of too many people throughout time and space, we just don't know what chapter we're on. Maybe not even what book we're in anymore. The human experience just doesn't hold answers to the question of why. So maybe it's time to change the question that we're asking. For Job, the text says that God answered him out of a whirlwind. But really, God begins to question Job. Over and over, God questions him. Where were you? How can you respond? What can you say about creation? It's unsettling and in many ways unsatisfying. But it is revealing. The challenge of innocent suffering, of injustice in this world points us to something deeper, greater, and more profound. It is a way to examine the nature of the relationship between God and humankind. In his despair, Job progresses through different understandings of who God is. At first, he grieves that the arrows of the Almighty are within him. The terrors of God are set against him. He understands God to be the author of suffering, actively involved. But he can't make sense of that in light of his innocence. And over time, in conversation with his friends, Job begins to long for communion with God. And he thinks of God as having abandoned him, separate. In Job 16:21, we read, I need someone to mediate between God and me, as a person mediates between friends. Finally, Job is convinced that if only he could be in God's presence, God would see his innocence. In chapter 23, he says, if only I knew where to find God, I would go to his court, I would lay out my case. He would give me a fair hearing. Job's thought shifts from asking why to asking what is the relationship between me and God? And finally, after a long time, God speaks. God reveals his presence right there in the whirlwind of human thought. And God ends up blessing Job with more than he had before. God is revealed to Job as the only cause and creator. Their relationship and Job's faith is forged in his trial by fire. And Job says, I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. What is it that we can work to see in the midst of suffering? Then and now, God's relationship with humanity is unconditional. It is of love, and it serves as a model for how we can be in relationship with one another. Something that I find particularly helpful in this book of questions and challenges is that asking those questions doesn't impoverish Job. It doesn't cause God to turn away. And whatever chapter you might be on, whatever questions you have, won't cause God to turn away either. Our faith, like Job's, can be made stronger in our trials and in walking with others in their times of trouble. It is often in times of anguish that we look beyond ourselves. And ultimately, that is what we are called to do as members of a beloved community. Keep asking questions. Don't be afraid to challenge and be challenged. You never know how many chapters you are away from being more blessed than you were at the beginning. And when you see innocent suffering, maybe you can be the one to sit in the ashes with a friend. And at the end, the person will say of God, I only heard about you before, but now I see you with my own eyes. Amen.